The autumn wind in Oak Ridge Park didn't just blow. It drifted through the bare branches of the maples, carrying the sharp, damp scent of wet asphalt, decaying leaves, and the distant, burnt aroma of cheap coffee from the brick kiosk near the pond. It was a Tuesday morning. Tuesdays were usually quiet in the park. The weekend joggers were back in their offices, the children were in classrooms, and the paved walking paths belonged mostly to the retirees, the early shift workers, and the people who simply had nowhere else they needed to be. Carter liked Tuesdays for exactly that reason. At 42, he had learned that the hardest part of leaving the Navy was adjusting to the noise of the civilian world. In the teams, noise had a purpose. A shout meant an order. A crack meant incoming. A hum meant an engine. In the city, noise was just clutter. It was car horns, sirens, people arguing over parking spaces, and the endless, mindless chatter of a world that never seemed to take a breath. It made the muscles in his jaw tight. It made his shoulders bunch up under his olive green canvas jacket. But on the damp paths of Oak Ridge Park, with the mist still hanging low over the duck pond, Carter could breathe. Walking beside him, perfectly aligned with his left knee, was Rex. Rex was an 8-year-old German shepherd with a coat the color of wet charcoal and burnt timber. To an untrained eye, Rex looked like any other large, well-groomed dog out for a morning stroll. But if you looked closer, if you knew what to look for, you would see the signs. You would see the faint, pale line of hairless scar tissue running along his left shoulder, a reminder of a hot night in a dusty valley 3,000 miles away. You would see the way his ears, large and alert, didn't just flap around. They swept the area like radar dishes, turning independently toward the sound of a bicycle tire 50 yards behind them, or a squirrel rustling in the brush to their right. Rex didn't pull on the leash. In fact, the leather strap hung in a loose, comfortable loop between Carter's fingers. They moved together with a shared, silent rhythm that had been forged in places where a tight leash or a sudden, loud bark could mean the difference between coming home or being carried back under a flag. "Easy, boy," Carter murmured, his voice barely louder than the rustle of his own jacket. Rex didn't look up, but his left ear twitched backward toward Carter. It was a simple acknowledgement. "I hear you." They reached their usual turning point, the old stone bridge that crossed the narrowest part of the pond. Every morning, Carter had a small, private ritual. He would stop at the top of the bridge, rest his hands on the cold, damp stone railing, and look down at the dark water. Rex would sit immediately by his left heel. His weight shifted slightly to his right side to favor his old, stiff shoulder. It was a quiet life. A boring life, some of his old teammates might say. But to Carter, boring was a luxury he had paid for in years of sleepless nights and cold meals. He liked the routine. He liked that the biggest decision of his day was whether to buy a medium or large drip coffee from the kiosk. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, dried liver treat. He didn't just hand it to Rex. That wasn't how they worked. Carter held the treat in his closed fist, tapped the top of Rex's head twice with his other hand, and then opened his palm. Rex took the treat with incredible gentleness, his dry nose brushing against Carter's skin. It was a silly domestic habit they had developed since retiring, a small piece of playfulness in a life that had once been entirely serious. "Good lad," Carter said, scratching the thick, soft fur behind Rex's ears. Their moment of quiet was broken by a sound that immediately made Rex's ears point forward. It wasn't a loud sound, not at first, just the distant, discordant noise of teenage laughter. Not the warm, genuine laughter of kids having fun, but the sharp, mocking barks of people who had found someone smaller or weaker to amuse themselves with. It was a sound Carter recognized instantly. It was the universal soundtrack of bullies. Carter straightened up from the stone wall. He didn't rush. One of the first things you learn in reconnaissance is that rushing makes you blind. You gather information first. you observe. 100 yards down the path, where the maples grew thickest and the asphalt was cracked by the roots of old elms, 3 teenagers were standing in a semicircle. They looked to be 16 or 17, dressed in oversized hoodies, their backpacks slung carelessly over one shoulder. They should have been in school, but instead, they were lingering near a wooden park bench, their body language loose, arrogant, and aggressive. In the center of their attention was an old man. He was small, his frame slightly bent under a heavy, dark blue wool coat that looked at least 3 sizes too big for him. The coat was old, the cuffs frayed, and one of the large horn buttons on the front was missing, replaced by a piece of wire twisted into a crude loop. He wore a faded blue baseball cap with the gold letters USS, or Riskany, stitched across the front, though the gold thread had long since turned a dull, dirty yellow. But it wasn't just the old man they were focused on. It was the creature at his feet. It was an old, shaggy terrier mix, perhaps a wire-haired pointing griffon, or just a very large, scruffy mutt whose ancestry was a mystery. The dog was completely gray around the muzzle, its coat matted in small clumps around its hindquarters. The dog's back legs were curved inward, stiff with the cruel, heavy hand of severe arthritis. Every few seconds, the old dog would try to take a step forward, his hind paws dragging along the rough asphalt with a dry, scraping sound. He would move perhaps 3 inches, his entire body trembling with the effort, before his back legs would give out, leaving him sitting awkwardly on the cold ground. The teenagers were delighted by this. "Look at it," the tallest of the 3, a kid in a red hoodie with a thin, wispy attempt at a mustache, laughed. He took a slow, exaggerated step, dragging his foot behind him in a mocking imitation of the dog. "Hey, old man, you need to put some oil on his gears. He's rusting out." The other 2 laughed, shoving each other's shoulders. One of them, a shorter, stockier kid with a black cap turned backward, reached down and picked up a handful of dry, hard acorns from the dirt beside the path. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed one. It bounced off the old dog's matted flank. The dog didn't yelp. He didn't have the energy for it. He just flinched, his head sinking lower toward the ground, his tail tucked so tightly against his belly that it was barely visible. "Leave him be," the old man said. His voice was thin, raspy, and cracked with age, like dry paper being crumpled. He reached down, his own hand shaking violently, with a tremor that had nothing to do with the cold, and tried to slip his fingers under the dog's chest to help him up. He's just trying to get home. He's had a long walk." "He's trash, old man," the kid in the red hoodie said, stepping closer. "You should throw him in the pond. Save yourself the trouble of dragging him." He tossed another acorn. This one struck the old man's boot. Carter watched this for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was all it took for his mind to categorize the situation. There was no tactical threat here, no weapons visible. Just 3 bored, ignorant boys who had never been taught the weight of a hand on a shoulder or the meaning of the word respect. He looked down at Rex. The German Shepherd hadn't growled. A trained military working dog doesn't growl to warn people. Growling is a waste of energy. But Rex's entire posture had changed. His head was level with his shoulders, his chest was deep and steady, and his tail was straight, held parallel to the ground. His amber eyes were locked onto the red hoodie. He was waiting for the command. "Rex?" Carter said, his voice flat, cool, and entirely devoid of anger. "Heel." They started walking. Their boots hit the asphalt in perfect unison. Thud, thud, thud. To the casual observer, it was just a man and his dog walking down a path. But as they closed the distance, the rhythm of their approach began to draw the attention of the teenagers. At 50 yards, the shorter kid with the backward cap glanced over his shoulder. He saw Carter. Carter wasn't a small man. He carried the broad, thick build of someone who had spent his youth carrying 80-pound packs through mountain passes, and his silver-rimmed hair gave him the hard, weathered look of a man who had seen too much of the world's dark corners. But the kid's eyes didn't stay on Carter. They dropped to Rex. Rex was looking directly at him, not with anger, but with that cold, terrifyingly intelligent focus that only working breeds possess. It was the look of a predator that had already decided where the weak points were. The shorter kid stopped laughing. He nudged the tall kid in the red hoodie. "Hey, look." The tall kid turned around, his smug grin still plastered on his face, though it wavered slightly when he saw the size of the German shepherd. He tried to puff out his chest, leaning against the wooden back of the park bench. "What? It's just a dog." Carter didn't say a word. He didn't yell. He didn't tell them to stop. He just kept walking, his pace steady, unhurried, and absolute. At 20 yards, the old man in the blue coat looked up. His eyes were watery, pale blue, and surrounded by deep, dark folds of skin. When he saw Carter and Rex, a look of profound embarrassment washed over his face. He didn't want a scene. He didn't want someone to see him like this, feeble, unable to protect his own companion, being mocked by children who weren't even old enough to drive. He turned his head away, his shaking hand resting on his dog's head. "Go on, Buster," he whispered to the scruffy mutt. "Just a little further, boy, come on." Buster made one more desperate attempt to rise, his hind leg catching on a crack in the pavement. He collapsed with a soft, breathy sigh, his chin resting on the cold concrete. Carter stopped 5 feet from the teenagers. Rex didn't wait for a command to sit. He stepped onto the concrete sidewalk, moving past Carter by exactly half a pace. He stood shoulder to shoulder with the old limping dog. He didn't bark. He didn't bare his teeth. He simply stood there, his massive chest broad, his head held high, his eyes fixed on the kid in the red hoodie. The silence that settled over the path was heavy. The only sound was the wind in the trees and the soft, trembling breaths of old Buster. The tall kid in the red hoodie tried to maintain his posture. He cleared his throat, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. "You got a problem, man?" he asked, his voice louder than it needed to be. The classic sign of a boy trying to convince himself he wasn't afraid. Carter looked at him, really looked at him. It was a gaze that had made captured insurgent commanders talk in dark rooms. It was the look of a man who knew exactly what he was capable of, and therefore had no need to show off. "No," Carter said softly. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "I don't have a problem. Do you?" The kid in the red hoodie shifted his weight. He looked at his friends, looking for backup, but the other two had already stepped back. The stocky kid who had been throwing the acorns had dropped them into the grass. He was looking at Rex's left shoulder, at the thick, hairless scar, and then at the heavy, tactical brass ring on Rex's collar. "We were just messing around," the short kid muttered, his backward cap tilted down as he looked at his shoes. "Just, you know, having some fun." "Fun," Carter repeated. He didn't say it like a question. He said it like a word he was examining under a microscope, finding it dirty. He stepped closer, and as he did, Rex shifted his weight, his ears flattening slightly, his tail dropping an inch. It was a subtle, tactical shift that meant one thing: if you move, I move. The tall kid in the red hoodie felt the temperature drop. The arrogance left his face, replaced by a sudden, pale realization that he was standing on a secluded path in a damp park with a man who looked like he had forgotten how to feel fear, and a dog that looked like it had been built in a factory that designed nightmares. "We're leaving," the tall kid said, his voice cracking slightly on the word leaving. He turned on his heel, not looking back, and started walking toward the park exit. The other two didn't wait. They followed him, their pace quick, their shoulders hunched, mumble arguing among themselves as they disappeared down the path toward the main street. Carter didn't watch them go. Once a threat was neutralized, it was no longer his concern. He turned his attention to the old man and the dog on the pavement. The old man was still kneeling, his hand resting on the scruffy mutt's back. He looked up at Carter, his pale eyes blinking against the damp mist. You didn't have to do that, son," he said softly. "They're just boys. They don't know any better." "They know," Carter said, kneeling down on the damp concrete beside him. He didn't care about the mud staining the knees of his jeans. They just chose to forget. He looked at the dog. Buster was indeed a mess. Up close, Carter could see the cloudy blue film of cataracts over the dog's eyes. His breath was shallow, and his joints were swollen to the size of walnuts. But when Rex leaned down, very slowly, his nose twitching, and gently sniffed Buster's ear, the old mutt didn't pull away. He let out a long, shuddering sigh and nudged his nose against Rex's front paw. "He's a good dog," Carter said. "The best," the old man said, his voice thick with a sudden surge of emotion he was trying desperately to hide. "His name's Buster. I got him, 12 years ago now. My wife had just passed. The house was too quiet. A house shouldn't be that quiet, you know?" "I know," Carter said. He knew that silence better than anyone. "He used to run," the old man said, a tiny, fragile smile touching his lips. "Lord, you should have seen him. He'd chase the gulls down by the lake. He'd run until his tongue hung out the side of his mouth like a pink ribbon. But these past 6 months, his hips. The vet says it's the arthritis. Some days he can walk to the end of the block. Today we made it to the park, but I think he used up all his gas." "Let's get him to a bench," Carter said. He didn't wait for the old man to ask for help. Carter slipped his arms under Buster's chest and hindquarters. The dog was surprisingly light, his bones feeling like dry twigs beneath his shaggy, matted coat. Buster didn't struggle. He just lay there, his head resting against Carter's shoulder, his heart beating in a fast, shallow rhythm. Rex stood up immediately, moving to Carter's left side as he stood. They walked the 10 yards to the nearest wooden park bench. Carter laid Buster down gently on the dry wood, arranging his old canvas jacket under the dog's head to keep him comfortable. The old man stood by, watching with a mixture of gratitude and awe. He adjusted his faded blue cap, his hand brushing against the gold letters. USS Oriskany. Carter noticed it this time. "The Oriskany," he said, pointing to the cap. "CVA 34, Mighty O." The old man's eyes lit up with a sudden, sharp clarity. The bent frame seemed to straighten by an inch. "You know her?" "My uncle served on her during the late 50s, Carter said, offering his hand. "Carter, former Navy." The old man took his hand. His grip was dry and trembling, but there was a surprising, lingering strength in his fingers. Arthur Vance. Boilerman 2nd class, Korea, chosen." Carter felt a cold chill go down his spine. The Chosen Reservoir, one of the most brutal, freezing, and heroic campaigns in naval and marine history. The men who survived Chosen were a different breed. They had fought in temperatures so cold that the oil in their rifles froze, and they had done it while surrounded by an enemy that outnumbered them 10 to 1. "It's an honor, Arthur," Carter said, and he meant it. He looked at the old, frayed coat with the wire button. He looked at the limping, gray-muzzled dog. This was a man who had stood in the frozen hell of Korea, who had kept his country safe, and now, in the twilight of his life, he was being mocked by boys who couldn't even keep their own pants pulled up. It made something hot and angry stir in Carter's chest, but he kept his face calm. "We were cold," Arthur said, his eyes looking past Carter, looking at the gray mist over the pond, as if he could see the white, frozen peaks of the mountains near the reservoir. So cold. You couldn't sleep. If you slept, you didn't wake up. I remember we found a little pup near the harbor at Hunnam. Just a scruffy little thing, no bigger than a boot. We hid him in the boiler room. The captain knew, of course, but he looked the other way. That little dog, we called him Soot. He kept us warm. We'd take turns holding him against our chests under our parkas. He saved more feet from frostbite than the medics did. Arthur looked down at Buster, his hand reaching out to stroke the dog's back. When I saw Buster at the shelter all those years ago, he had those same scruffy ears. I knew he was my boy. Rex had sat down beside the bench, but he hadn't just sat. He had positioned himself so that his head was resting on the bench, right next to Buster's front paws. Buster opened his cloudy eyes, looked at the massive German shepherd, and slowly, weakly, licked the side of Rex's nose. Rex didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He just blinked his amber eyes and let out a soft, low huff of warm air that stirred the gray fur on Buster's face. "They like each other," Arthur said, his voice softening. "Rex is a good judge of character," Carter said. "He doesn't waste his time on people who aren't worth it." They sat on the bench together for a long time. Carter pulled 2 paper cups of coffee from his pack. He always carried a thermos on their long walks, and handed one to Arthur. It wasn't fancy, just black and hot, but the old boiler man drank it like it was the finest nectar on earth, his hands holding the warm paper cup to his chest, just like he must have held that little pup in the boiler room 65 years ago. As they talked, Carter learned more about Arthur's life. He lived alone in a small, rent-controlled apartment 3 blocks from the park. His pension was small, barely enough to cover his rent, his groceries, and his own medication. "The vet," Arthur said, looking down at his cup. "She's a nice lady, Dr. Evans. She told me there's a medicine that can help Buster's joints. Some kind of injection they do once a month. Says it makes them feel like a pup again. But it's $80 a shot. I just don't have $80 to spare, Carter. Some months, it's a choice between his food or my pills, and I can't let him go hungry." Carter didn't say anything. He didn't offer to pay for it right then. He knew men like Arthur. They had survived Chosen. They had survived a life of hard, manual labor. They didn't want charity. They didn't want handouts. If you offered them money, they would close up like a clam, thank you politely, and then you'd never see them in the park again. But Carter was a Navy SEAL. If there was one thing they were trained to do, it was to find a way around an obstacle when a direct attack was impossible. "Where do you live, Arthur?" Carter asked. "Over on Elm Street," Arthur said. "The brick building with the green awning, number 4B. "We'll walk you home," Carter said. When they stood up, Buster tried to get off the bench, but his back legs immediately buckled. He let out a small, frustrated whine. "I've got him," Carter said. He picked up the old dog again, cradling him against his chest. But as they started down the path, something strange happened. Rex didn't take his usual position at Carter's left knee. Instead, he stepped to the right, placing himself directly beside Arthur. He slowed his pace. He didn't walk with his usual long, athletic stride. He moved with a slow, deliberate, almost agonizingly careful gait, matching Arthur's limping 3-inch steps exactly. Arthur looked down at the massive shepherd beside him. He let out a soft, wheezing laugh. "Look at him, Carter. He's escorting me." "He's a sentinel, Arthur," Carter said, carrying Buster. "He knows who's in charge of the detail." It took them 20 minutes to walk the 3 blocks to Arthur's apartment. Every few yards, people would stop and look. They saw a tall man in a canvas jacket carrying a scruffy, sleeping dog, and beside him, an old man in a faded navy cap being escorted by a majestic German shepherd that looked like he was marching in a parade. It was a strange sight, but it was a beautiful one. At the door of the brick building, Carter set Buster down on the tiled lobby floor. The old dog seemed to have recovered some of his strength in the warmth of the building. He stood up, his tail giving a weak, happy wag as he looked toward the elevator. "Thank you, Carter," Arthur said, holding the door open. "And thank you, Rex." Rex stepped forward, tapped his nose against Arthur's hand, and then sat, his eyes watching the elevator doors close as Arthur and Buster disappeared inside. Carter stood in the lobby for a moment, his hands in his pockets. The silence was back, but it didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like a plan. He walked back to the park kiosk. The girl working the register was named Sarah. She was a college student, 21 or 22, with a kind face and a habit of giving Rex a free biscuit whenever they stopped by. "Hey, Carter," she said, leaning over the counter to wave at Rex. "You guys look like you've been on a mission." "We have," Carter said. He leaned against the wooden counter. "You know the old man who walks the gray dog, Arthur?" "Oh, yeah." Sarah's face fell. "Mr. Vance. He's so sweet. But his dog, oh, it breaks my heart. Some days Buster can barely make it across the grass. I tried to help him once, but Mr. Vance is so proud. He wouldn't let me carry him." "He's a chosen reservoir survivor," Carter said. Sarah blinked. "What's that?" "It means he's a hero," Carter said simply. "And his dog needs help. There's a medication that can make his life easier, but Arthur can't afford it." He pulled a $100 bill from his wallet, part of his monthly disability pension, and laid it on the counter. "I want to start a fund, a jar, right here on the counter. Buster's Vet Fund. But we don't mention Arthur's name. We just call it the Park Canine Fund. If people ask, we say it's for the old dogs of Oak Ridge." Sarah looked at the bill, then up at Carter. A slow, warm smile spread across her face. "You got a pen?" By that afternoon, a large glass mayonnaise jar sat next to the cash register at the park kiosk. On the front, in Sarah's neat, colorful handwriting, was a sign. Buster's Escort Fund. Help our neighborhood heroes keep walking. Underneath the sign, she had taped a photo she had taken on her phone of Rex and Buster sitting together on the wooden bench, their noses almost touching. Oak Ridge was a small community, the kind of place where people noticed things but rarely knew how to help. The jar didn't stay empty for long. The joggers, the moms with strollers, the retirees, even the local mail carrier, they all knew Buster. They had all seen him struggling on the path, and they all knew Rex. Within 3 days, the jar was full. They were singles, $5 bills, and more than a few 50s dropped in by people who had seen the tall Navy vet and his shepherd guarding the path. On Friday morning, Carter walked into the Oak Ridge Veterinary Clinic. The air smelled of antiseptic, wet fur, and the clean scent of laundry detergent. Behind the counter was Dr. Evans, a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair and a gentle, direct manner. "Carter," she said, looking up from her computer, "is Rex's shoulder flaring up again with the cold?" "Rex is fine," Carter said, resting his elbows on the high counter. "I'm here about Buster Vance." Dr. Evans sighed, her shoulders dropping. "Arthur's dog, I know. I've been trying to find a way to discount those Librela injections for him, but the pharmaceutical rep won't budge on the cost. Arthur won't let me do it for free either. He nearly walked out of the office last month when I tried to waive the exam fee." Carter reached into his canvas bag and pulled out a thick envelope. Inside was $720, the first week's collection from the jar at the kiosk. He laid it on the counter. "This is from the park," Carter said. "It's Buster's account. Every month, you do the injection. You tell Arthur that a local veterans charity is sponsoring his dog. You tell him it's a canine service benefit for chosen survivors." Dr. Evans looked at the envelope. She opened it, her fingers running over the crumpled ones and $5 bills, the money of 100 different neighbors who had bought a coffee and left their change. Her eyes softened, and she looked up at Carter with a look that made him shift his weight awkwardly. "You're a good man, Carter," she said. "I'm just a guy with a dog," Carter said. Rex did most of the work. The next Tuesday, the mist was gone. The morning was cold, clear, and bright, the sun reflecting off the frost on the grass like a million tiny diamonds. Carter and Rex walked down the paved path, their boots and paws hitting the ground in that same steady, comforting rhythm. When they reached the stone bridge, Carter stopped. He looked down at the water, which was clear and blue under the bright sky. Rex sat by his heel. He didn't look at the water. His ears were pointed forward, locked onto the path ahead. 100 yards away, coming through the maples, was Arthur. He was still wearing the oversized blue coat with the wire button, and his faded USS Oriskany cap was tilted back on his head. But he wasn't walking with that slow, agonizing 3-inch shuffle. His stride was longer, his frame looked lighter, and his face was split by a grin that seemed to erase 20 years of worry. And beside him was Buster. The old dog was still scruffy, still gray around the muzzle, but he was walking. His hind legs were straight, his head was up, and his tail was wagging in a slow, happy circle, like a hairy helicopter propeller. He wasn't dragging his paws. He was stepping cleanly, his nails clicking on the asphalt with a sharp, cheerful sound. Click, click, click. When Buster saw Rex, he let out a sharp, happy bark. The first time Carter had ever heard his voice. The old mutt actually broke into a clumsy, joyful trot, his ears flopping as he covered the distance between them. Rex didn't wait for Carter's command. He stood up, his tail wagging once, a rare concession of emotion, and met Buster halfway. The two dogs circled each other on the path, sniffing ears, touching noses, their breath rising in white clouds in the cold morning air. Buster tried to play bow, his front legs dropping to the ground, his rear end in the air, his tail wagging furiously. Rex, the highly trained, combat-hardened military working dog, dropped his own massive chest to the pavement, submitting completely to the scruffy old terrier's game. Arthur walked up, his eyes bright, his hand shaking as he wiped a tear from his cheek before Carter could see it. "You won't believe it, Carter," Arthur said, his voice trembling with excitement. "The vet called me. She said there's a special program, a Naval Canine Foundation. They looked up my service records on the Oriskany, and they said Buster qualifies for full medical coverage. They came to the apartment and gave him his first shot last Friday." Arthur looked down at his dog, who was currently trying to climb onto Rex's back, while Rex lay perfectly still, letting him do it. "Look at him. He's like a pup again. He hasn't moved like this in 3 years." "That's great news, Arthur," Carter said, his face completely serious, though his eyes carried a soft, warm light. "Must be a good foundation." "The best," Arthur said. "The absolute best." They started walking down the path together, but as they moved, Rex didn't return to Carter's side. He stepped to the right, positioning himself exactly next to Buster. He didn't run. He didn't try to lead. He matched Buster's trot, his shoulder brushing against the old mutt's side, acting as a living shield between the scruffy dog and the rest of the world. Whenever a bicycle went past, Rex would shift his body slightly, his eyes locked on the rider until they were gone, his presence ensuring that no one and nothing would ever disturb Buster's walk again. Arthur looked at the two dogs, then up at Carter. "You know, Carter," the old boilerman said softly, his hand resting on the frayed collar of his wool coat. "I thought this world had forgotten about old things. Old sailors, old dogs, were not very useful anymore." Carter stopped on the path. He looked at the old man, his voice quiet, firm, and absolute. "The world doesn't forget, Arthur," Carter said. "Sometimes it just needs a reminder of what a hero looks like." They kept walking. The sun climbed higher over Oak Ridge Park, burning away the last of the frost, turning the wet grass to gold. And down the sidewalk, side by side, two old soldiers and their dogs walked home. The silence between them no longer a weight, but the quiet, beautiful peace of a mission accomplished.